All righty, everyone. Welcome back to For the Sake of Argument. We are in part 2 of finding claims, evidence, reasoning, assessing its value. So, yesterday we read an article that talked about zoos should be banned. And when we ended the day, you finished a graphic organizer that looks something similar to this. And so we talked about the idea of being sure that you give your students a graphic so that it makes it very easy for them to see and to be able to do what we're going to ask them to do when it comes to evaluating and assessing. If you try to force them to do it from the paper or from the text itself, sometimes they can get overwhelmed with just so much text. So pulling it out and putting it into a graphic organizer makes it, one, appealing to the eye, and two, it makes it easier for the students to be able to point to write their evidence and proof. Okay, so yesterday we went from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade partially of your standards. So 8th grade, the last portion of that, we had to look at what was relevant, irrelevant, and what was sufficient. So the first portion of this is going to be us looking at that. But first, our objectives today are going to be we are going to be able to identify the validity of claims that are made. We're going to share with you a quick little easy way to assess the validity of a claim. And then we're also going to dive into slant and bias. All right, so if you teach 8th grade, this is the last component of teaching argument. So again, yesterday we talked about everything has to start with defining. So you have to always lead with the definition so that students understand. So when we talk about relevance, relevance means that it is closely connected to something and that it is appropriate. So since we're talking about claims, the evidence, and reasoning, the evidence has to be closely connected. It has to be appropriate. So when we're asking students to find the relevance, we're asking them basically two things. One, does the evidence stay on topic? And two, does it fit the context of the narrative? Remember that we talked about anytime you're assessing something, you're judging it. So they have to have context. They have to have a rubric. And so this is how they're going to judge it. So when you look at this particular graphic organizer that we completed based on zoos being banned, can you look at my evidence and tell me in the chat bar, yes or no, does my evidence for reason 1, does it fit the context and does it stay on topic? Yes or no? Respond in the chat for me. For you, reason number 1, where it says zoos breed inhumanely. So when you look at those evidence boxes, we talked about the killing of the giraffe in Copenhagen, and we talked about it using money. It doesn't use the money to improve living spaces. Ms. Brown, you're absolutely correct. It does. Okay, so when we look at reason number 2, when they say absolutely, because killing animals for profit is inhumane. So when we look at reason number 2, it says they don't effectively help animals return to the wild. When you look at those 3 pieces of evidence, reply in the chat. Does it fit the topic and does it fit the context for reason number 2? All the pieces there. Yes or no? And if you aren't able to chat, you can speak out. The second statement absolutely does. Thank you, Ms. Brown. And then reason number 3, when we look at reason number 3, if you were to identify a piece of evidence that you thought was irrelevant based on this, which piece in reason number 3? Is it box 1, box 2, or box 3? Three? So when we look at reason number 3, it doesn't provide enough evidence. It could either be box 2 or box 3, because when we're trying to help our students identify what's relevant and what's irrelevant and which pieces of evidence they need to switch out, we make sure that we use this rubric as a way to kind of gauge it. So then we look at sufficiency. Sufficiency is a condition or quality of being adequate. You have enough of it. There's ample evidence. So if something is ample, I'm making an argument or I'm making a claim, I'm not just going to have one piece of evidence that supports. Ample means you have more than enough. And then when we talk about sufficiency, we give the students a rubric. So does it meet the need, which is the burden of proof, because you're arguing a statement? What you want matches what you have. You want me to believe X, Y, Z. Do you have enough to support that? And then how do I know? There's more than one piece of evidence is convincing and compelling. So just at first glance, which reason would you feel like does not have sufficient evidence? Reason 1, 2, or 3? Number 3. Okay. 3. So Ms. Stewart says number 3, and the reason why is because if we pull out box 2 and box 3, that reason only has now one piece of sufficient evidence. Okay. So definitely of all the reasons that are the strongest, it would be reason number 2. So if we're giving feedback to a student, it makes it very easy for us to go in and say, okay, reason number 1 and reason number 3, we need to find better pieces of evidence. And so as a student, it's not frustrating to have to rewrite an entire paper, but in my graphic organizer, if I can go and find 2 pieces of evidence that are better, that can support that, then it makes it easier for me to do a revision of the argument that I have made. Okay. All right, so then lastly, we look at what is irrelevant. So we tell students that irrelevant evidence is anything that's not connected or is not appropriate. And by that, we mean that it is off topic. So if it's irrelevant, that means it's not needed. We can take it out and still have the meat of the argument. Or it does not fit the context or the narrative. So if we're talking about zoos, but then for whatever reason we go off on a tangent about animals in the wild, then that information becomes irrelevant because you're trying to convince me of why zoos should be banned. Okay, so keeping that in mind, students go back and they look at the reasons and the evidence and they say, is anything off topic? If it is, we need to put an X on it. We'll mark it out. Does it fit the context? If it doesn't, we put an X on it and we mark it out. If you're teaching writing and you're having the students build by using this as a mentor text, keep in mind that the students can fill in their graphic organizer, and before they ever write their argument, you help them determine what's relevant and irrelevant, what's sufficient and what's not sufficient when it comes to writing before they try to formulate their paper. So now we move into the 9-12 shift, okay? And because I've only had 2 people respond in my chat, I need for everyone who's listening to type in the chat, I'm here. All right. Okay. I see you.
There they are.
All right, good. All right, so as we move into the 9-12 shift, we are going to focus on a non-print text. And in this non-print text, we chose this because I think sometimes we get boxed into actually giving the students a written argument or a written speech. And so we want to show you some of the pitfalls that students can fall into, or even we as teachers and as adults can fall into, just by listening to a speech and not really going in to dive into it. So we're going to take about 13 minutes to watch this TED Talk on gender equity. And so while we are watching, I want you to pull on what you learned yesterday about claims. So as we're watching, I want you to jot down at least one or two claims somewhere on a piece of paper or a sticky note that you hear being made, because we're going to discuss that in the next portion of this. All right.
So I was one of 6 guests on a $22 million yacht. We were off the coast of Honduras on the island of Roatan, and our yacht had become grounded on a sandbar in a cove. As the captain floated the anchor to winch us back into open water, I sat on the top deck and looked out at the windowless shanties surrounding that cove, and I thought, what am I doing here? I thought I was there because of my own good work. I was the CEO of a growing nonprofit. That's how I met the chairman of a television network and joined his board. It was his yacht. Did I mention that all 6 guests on that yacht were white male CEOs, including me? I always knew I was privileged. I just didn't realize exactly how privileged I was. I went to college for free because my father was on the board of directors. That happens for everybody, right? I got preferential treatment in 2 out of my 3 graduate school programs. I donated a lot of money back to the nonprofit with which I worked, but then I also earned way more than anybody else, so there was that. But I was a CEO in my 30s and taking trips on private jets and expensive yachts all seemed normal to me because I was one of the good guys. I was supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment. I made sure women were on the boards of several of the corporations with which I worked, though I never did make sure a woman was in the top spot. In fact, I did not even have a woman on my own senior leadership team at my own company. I look back at that now and it's more than a little bit embarrassing. The line from Yeats's poem Vacillation comes to mind. And not a day but something is recalled, my conscience or my vanity appalled. I knew from the time I was 3 or 4 years of age I was transgender. There were a lot of reasons I did not transition until later in life, not the least of which was knowing how devastating it was going to be for my family. But there were other reasons. One of them I really hate to admit. Because one of the reasons I did not transition earlier was because I did not want to give up my power or my income. I was comfortable as an affluent white male. And once I transitioned, oh my, everything changed. Within 7 days, I lost every single one of my jobs, and I would not have been invited onto a rowboat, let alone a $22 million yacht. Not exactly the life I was planning for. I was able to build a new life, but it was way, way harder than it was before. I live in the borderlands. Now, I'm completely comfortable in the world of women, but I will always be a little bit of an expat from another land. It's my reality. That said, there's a lot I'm learning that guys, men, I don't think there's any way you could learn unless you also transition genders. So just for brevity's sake, we're going to make the assumption that's not likely to happen. Seems like a safe assumption. So maybe you can hear me out. So you get home from work and you have that deer in the headlights look because your wife is absolutely furious with you and you were clueless as to the reason, but you have been married long enough to know not to argue with her. And so you just admit your guilt, even though you have no idea if you're admitting to a misdemeanor or a felony. You know that feeling? Yeah, I know that feeling. Guys, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but most of the time that happens, it's because you deserve it. I see there are people who agree. There are things you just don't get. I know I didn't either. I know you're one of the good guys. I know you work hard to get it right. I know you've run the race with integrity, but here's the thing. You started closer to the finish line than anyone else. That's the reality. I know. I did too. Women in America earn between 53 and 79 cents on the dollar of what men earn. 6.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs are female. 4.8% of Silicon Valley CEOs. 3% of venture capital goes to female-owned firms. You know, the myth is that women don't get raises because they don't ask for them. The reality is they ask for them every bit as often as men do. They just don't get them. That's the reality. I'm sure you've heard a lot of these statistics before. I know I certainly had, but they never really registered with me. But oh, they register with me now. Because now I'm living those statistics. So I thought maybe I would bring at least a little bit of my privilege with me in my new life. You know, I could go into a business meeting and let's say things go sideways in the meeting and I become angry. Well, I would be allowed to express my anger because certainly as a male, I was allowed to express my anger. It was just a sign of passion for the subject. Yeah, as a female, you express anger in a business meeting, the whole room goes dead silent, and now you're that crazy woman. Then someone takes you aside and says, oh dear, you're much too emotional, which then actually causes you to become a crazy woman. It is maddening. So no, apparently I did not bring my privilege with me, or so I thought. I was building my new life and I became one of 3 co-leaders of a new young growing nonprofit. We each had our areas of responsibility and our startup was thriving. But then one day, one of my coworkers came to me, one of my co-leaders, and she said, so on paper it says that we're co-equal leaders, but in reality, it doesn't really work out that way. In reality, your opinion wins every single time. Now, some of that is because I need to step up. I understand that. But some of that is because your opinion wins every single time. And somewhere way down deep inside, I knew she was right. So I had brought my privilege with me. I was traveling a lot all around the United States and Europe speaking, and there were times that people had to pick up the slack for me at home, but that was okay because I had decades of experience in the field. My contribution was important. It was still all about me, all about my work, my agenda, just like when I was a guy. And it's not the person I wanted to be. And I was lost, really lost. But I discovered that's all right because lost is a place too. And you know, sometimes you just have to spend some time in a place called lost, right? Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, but we all find out lost is a place too. And you just have to stay there till you can figure things out. And I thought, what do I need to do to make it right? But then I was talking to one of my very best friends, and I said, what should I do? And she said, well, now that you know you brought your privilege with you, don't you think it might be time to give it up? And I said, and why? Exactly. Do I consider you to be one of my best friends? But I knew she was right. And so I stepped down from leadership so a very capable woman could step up into the lead spot. But here's a troubling question. Would I have done that if I was still living as a male? I'm not sure I would have. I might have stopped that conversation before it ever even really began. Deference is difficult for men. Deference is not a respected male trait. But until female traits are respected as much as male traits, we're never going to get anywhere near gender equity. So guys, what if? What if you really, really got it? What if you really, really understood just how much the world is tilted in your favor? What would you do then? You know, when I was still living as Paul, I'm not sure I really believed that the world was tilted in my favor. I had to transition to figure that out. I wish I could go back and whisper in Paul's ear. I would say, dude, get your act together. Cut your salary and create pay equity in this company, and step down from your position as CEO sooner than you were expecting so a woman could take your place. Would I have listened? Oh, I hope so. Because there's so much hanging in the balance of guys like Paul listening and doing the right thing. And you say, but I'm not a CEO. What can I do? You know, one single thing would make a huge difference, guys. If in all of your interactions with women, you would assume that a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly, it would go a very long way. Yeah. Yep, that plus stop interrupting us, really. Just stop interrupting. Just stop. Men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. But those two things would not bring us to gender equity. We will not achieve gender equity just by giving women more leadership opportunities. Men, we will not achieve gender equity until you're willing to give women your leadership opportunities. That's the reality. And guys, what do you get for that? Well, first of all, it's profitable. Companies that have true gender equity increase their profitability by no less than 10 to 15%. Second, guys, you'll have far fewer deer in the headlights moments related to the females in your life. Just saying, nice side benefit. But most importantly, you'll be creating a far more just world for your own daughters and granddaughters. You know, I never took another trip on that yacht. And for a long time, I thought about the inequality I saw there that day and the fact that I had done virtually nothing about it and still wasn't doing anything about inequality. But you know, it's never too late to do the right thing. We are all on a journey into the unknown, undertaken when really we rather would just be sitting on the couch binge watching somebody else's journey. But this living is serious business. And we are all pilgrims, called forward by our better angels toward the greater good. And for all the uncertainty, we can know two things. The world can change for the better, but somebody has to pay the price. We will not achieve gender equity by giving women more leadership opportunities, guys. We will achieve gender equity when you make sure women have your leadership opportunities. Thank you.
All righty. So there are 2 points that I want to make sure that I make. One, this particular text was chosen because 11th and 12th grade requires that the text that is chosen is a work of public advocacy. Okay. And two, we understand our audience and we want you guys to be able to go through the text. We want you to be able to go through the text just like we did with the zoo article, but from a stance of public advocacy. So my first question to you guys, stop, let's go back. So my first question, I would like a few brave people to unmute yourself. What are your initial thoughts on this argument? Is it a good argument? Is it a valid argument? This is without having done any type of assessment of the argument. What's your takeaway from this speech?
Ms. Brinkley says valid because he's lived both sides.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Do you think it's valid or not valid? Just your initial thoughts. Boy, y'all are quiet today. Valid. Not only has he lived both sides, but he also questions things both ways. Okay, so he's bringing to this element of dual perspectives. Okay, good. All right, so I want you to keep in mind, even if you didn't speak, I want you to think how you feel about this particular argument right now, if you feel it's valid, because now we're going to get into dissecting the argument. All right, we're going to move into breakouts. And when you get into your breakouts, you will find your group number on this participant slide starting with 23 through 38. Okay. Once there, you will find the transcript from what we watched today or what we just watched. And I want you to follow the same protocol that we did yesterday. In your group, discuss the claims, highlight them in yellow, find reasons, highlight them in pink, and find evidence and highlight it in green. Okay, you're not going to have long on this. We're going to give you about 10 minutes. So once you get into your breakout rooms, dig in. Okay, so Ms. Lane has dropped the participant link in the chat box, and she's going to send us to our breakout rooms.
Okay, so welcome back. I think we've got everyone back at this point. And I'm apologizing already because I know that you did not get enough time to get through this text. As we explained to begin with, it's a more difficult text. We're looking at it from a high school sort of lens here. So yeah, we apologize about that, but we hope you had some time to at least start, putting those same protocols in that we did yesterday, looking for the claims and the evidence and reasoning. And so what we have here on the screen is basically Ms. Lucas and I took apart the article and we kind of came up with these different sections for his reason or her reasons and evidences throughout the speech. And so hopefully as you guys were working through it, you found some of the same reasons. You found sort of the bigger claim that gender equality is achieved only when white men give up their positions of power in leadership. And so I know a couple of the groups that I popped in were kind of talking about that big claim. We didn't get that until all the way at the end of the speech. Like, what is she really trying to tell us in this article? So the reasons that we see there, hopefully yours are similar. However, as we work through the next few slides, you're going to see why we may have had some differences here, why we might see one thing, you guys might see one thing as evidence or proof, while Ms. Lucas and I saw things a little bit differently. So the first part of that is all about validity. How valid are the reasons that have been given? And when we think about this, what we have created here is sort of a tangible type rubric for students to use in order to figure out, is this reasoning actually valid? So we're looking at those reasons, those items in those small white boxes. And for these, we're thinking about what is actually valid. So we want you to go back right now and look at some of the reasons that you identified and decide, are some of your reasons not valid, judging by this little rubric we have here? Are there facts to support? Is there evidence to support your reasons? And if not, then that's not a valid reason. And when you start really breaking this up, we don't have maybe quite as much evidence and validity as we may have originally thought we did once we start looking at how much is there to support those reasons. So if you will, unmute yourself or respond in the chat. Is there a reason that you see now that may not be as valid? Is there one of those reason 1, 2, 3 that may not be as valid as possibly the other reason? Some brave soul, please share out from your group findings. And you can share out in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
I'm not feeling the evidence for reason 2.
Okay. All right. So when we look at that evidence and we start thinking about reason 2, white men have a privilege that women don't have. If we look at this tangible little, chart here, are those facts credible? Are they facts? Is the evidence limited? So when we look at this, women ask for raises but don't get them. Where's the proof for that? How do we know that? Men are allowed to express their anger without being labeled as crazy. Again, we start sort of asking ourselves these questions about that validity. So this chart, again, just sort of a tangible way, because a lot of us would say, well, it's valid because he's lived both sides, period, end of story. But when we start thinking about the actual facts that are used and we look at this chart, we can see that maybe it's not as valid as we originally thought it was. Okay. So for the next part of why we may not have thought that it was quite as valid as we originally were perceiving it to be, we're going to talk about fallacies. So thinking about fallacies, that's really part of our high school target in our standards, and we really want to first of all understand what is a fallacy. So a fallacy is a mistaken belief, especially based off of unsound argument. So these are those logical gaps. So they kind of sound like they make sense, but when you really start looking at them, these fallacies invalidate our arguments completely. So there are a lot of different types of fallacies. We're going to touch on some of the most significant ones, especially for this particular article. So here you have the bandwagon fallacy, which we're probably pretty aware of that one. Everybody believes it, so it must be true. And as I'm going through these fallacies, I'm hoping that you're going to hear some of these things and say, oh yeah, I heard her when she did that, or I remember her doing that in her speech. So there were a couple of times when she said, we all know that. So again, that's your bandwagon fallacy. Then the next one, the hasty generalization and the correlation causation fallacy. So for both of these, we don't necessarily have enough evidence to support the conclusion that is drawn. And for the correlation here, you just simply we're saying because something is this way, this is the reason. So if you look at this example, the views were down in April, so we changed the color. That means changing the color led to less views. Well, that doesn't make sense. It's an illogical argument because you can't just base it. Now, one that we see a lot in this particular speech, and I hope you'll be able to identify it, is anecdotal fallacies. So these anecdotal fallacies, that's when we're substituting scenes or little stories from a person's life or their own experience. We're substituting those in place of facts. So when we said that second reason didn't really sound, 100% for us, I think a big part of that is because a lot of the reasoning was based on that speaker's experience, not necessarily facts that we can go back and check to see where they came from. Okay. So some of the other most important fallacies, the straw man fallacy. So this one, when your opponent just oversimplifies an argument. So making it easier to attack or refute. So if you look at this example, I think we should hire someone to redesign our website. So you're saying we throw away all of our money instead of building up our in-house design team? That person jumped completely to conclusions that the original person never even said. So it really it invalidates the whole argument of what the original person said. Now, the next one, burden of proof, Ms. Lucas talked about that a little bit earlier. Just because there's no evidence presented, that doesn't make it true. So just because you don't have the evidence, just because nobody's saying it isn't a thing, that doesn't mean it is. You have to have evidence for both ways, the burden of truth for both ways. Now, the last two here are two of our favorites. First of all, the tu quo que. Yes, we learned how to pronounce that correctly. You're welcome. For this one, basically an invalid attempt to discredit an opponent by offering criticism. So instead of actually, giving reasons or disputing the claim, we see that the person is just criticizing the claim and the person itself, not giving us reasons to back it up. So I don't think John would be a good fit to manage this project because he doesn't have a lot of experience. Well, John says, well, you don't have a lot of experience in the project either. He never went to that claim. He never gave us any evidence that that claim was or was not true. He just criticized the other person. So that's our tu quo que. And then our last fallacy that we want to focus on here is our Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So this is one that we try to pretend it doesn't happen, but it definitely does. Instead of letting the full spectrum of evidence lead to that conclusion, basically our person is just cherry picking their data so that their data tells a story instead of you getting a story from the data. And they may ignore evidence that goes against what they're trying to argue, just completely leaving any evidence out if it goes against what they were saying. Okay.
All right, so now we move into the idea of a premise. And so yesterday we talked about a claim being a statement that may or may not be true, that more than likely doesn't have evidence attached to it, okay? Or doesn't have to have evidence attached to it. You can make a claim and not support it. Now, that is not in the best interest of having a solid argument, but it can happen. Whereas a premise is a statement or statements that you believe to be true. And the idea of it being believed is that you have drawn a conclusion based off of experiences or fact. So you build your argument around a conclusion that you've drawn. So the first thing that you do would be to define it for your students. Then you would have them locate a premise. Now, a premise is just like a theme or a central idea. It can be explicit or it can be implicit. In this particular argument, you hear him say, what if you realize just how much the world is tilted in your favor? So he's talking there about privilege, and he's explicitly saying the world is tilted in your favor. But the hidden premise there is saying that white men have a privilege that women do not. And so when we're talking about premise, we're looking at what's actually stated and then what underlying message are they trying to send. So sometimes your premise can get tricky. So then you would have the students go in, define, and locate that conclusion. So then there's this other element of slant and bias. So when you think about slant, I want you to think about it like italics, right? So if something is italicized, it leans in one direction, and that's what slant is. So you give information, but a lot of the information you give is in a particular angle, which kind of makes it biased or unfair. Whereas bias is a straight up prejudice towards something. So you have now prejudice could be good or bad. Okay, so prejudice in a favor of something or against something or a person or a group. And so the way you tell the story, the way you present information is in an unfair state. Okay, and so when you're talking about bias and you're teaching bias to students, a great tool that you could use is the media bias chart. And in this media bias chart, you get a good glimpse of where the news sources fall. So if you're looking for informational texts that really are on opposite sides of the spectrum, you want to make sure you look and you can kind of see who's a little left, who's a little right. And so you can find particular topics and read just how different they are. So when you're wanting your students to understand bias, you can use this chart as a way to kind of research where you want to find your articles. Okay. It's just a real neat chart. And then, so when we're talking about slant, a slant example would be same topic, was talking about Congress passing a bill to help Americans. The slant CNN has pressure mounts as on Congress to help struggling Americans as COVID-19 surges, right? That same article on Fox says, amid COVID-19 pandemic, Congress is working to restore Americans' income. What do you notice about those two titles, even though they're talking about the same thing? Any brave soul? The wording, absolutely. Very different vocabulary with different connotations. So when you're teaching bias to students, the key is to teach them to look at the word choice. Pull out the word choice, look at the vocabulary, see if it's loaded. And if it is, it will help you determine what this article or this person, this argument is in favor of or is not in favor of. Okay. All right. So once you determine the premise, then you have to determine what is the purpose. So if you think about this particular argument in the chat box, what do you think was the purpose of him telling us about this premise? What do you think was the purpose of him saying, what if you realize just how much the world is tilted in your favor? What is he trying to do? What is his whole goal in this argument, or her whole goal in this argument? What is she trying to do? Is she trying to define something? Is she trying to inform us, or is she trying to persuade us? Expose men to their bias, absolutely. Persuade. So that's it. She's trying to inform us, and she's trying to persuade us. I'm informing you that there is a different life that women don't see and a privilege that men have as opposed to women. And then in the bottom portion of that argument, she's trying to persuade us that, hey, men, you need to give up your roles so that women can fit into them. Okay. So we're not going to do a scavenger hunt for time, but if you were doing this in your class, specifically, absolutely, Miss Smoot, she's trying to persuade men. Absolutely. So if you were doing this in your class, you could easily break the kids up into a scavenger hunt by their birthday month and have them look for different things within the article. So my January through April kids would look for fallacies. My May through August will look for hidden premises. And then my September through December babies would look for bias and slant. And this just is a different way to kind of break up the monotony of what kids are doing with the argument itself. Okay.
So as we're moving through these upper level standards, we begin to look at the value of the reasoning as a whole. So our next two steps between this reasoning and then evaluating the whole argument, we are looking to see if the set of reasons makes sense because there's a clear correlation between the claim and all of the reasons presented. So this is where we start to sort of take a step back from digging in those little tiny details of the argument, and we start looking at, do all of my reasons work together? And this is how we evaluate those reasons. Do they fit the context? Can these reasons be verified by others? Is there a consensus on these reasons? And then the last one, and maybe the most important, I don't know, but are these reasons rooted in facts? So just thinking about this article, how useful are the reasons in persuading the audience that this idea or action is right or wrong? So looking at these reasons, and you can you can put it in the chat bar real quick for us, but how effective are these reasons? white men start closer to the finish, white men have a privilege that women don't, and deference is not a respectable trait for men. So do these reasons work together well to support that overall claim that men must give up their positions of leadership in order for women to move forward? What do you guys think? Looking at all of them together, the correlation between all of them. Reason 1 and reason 2 are very similar, yes. And so because of that, are we just repeating the same thing? That takes away from, our validity in that reasoning. Other thoughts? Thank you, Ms. Sturtevant. And then Ms. Latham says that she doesn't find reason 3 to be valid at all. So when we really start looking at that big claim, does that reason does it work? Does it support the context? And, I think you're correct, Ms. Latham, in the fact that you found that it's more based in opinion than fact. So when we go back to our criteria, there's no fact. There's not much support for reason 3. So thank you. Now, last step for our students, we're going to be looking at that argument as a whole. So going back, thinking through the whole argument, the whole set of reasons given with the aim of persuading others. So we're looking at the whole thing. Here's where you ask yourself, is this a strong argument? So we've spent a lot of time looking at the reasons, we've evaluated the reasons, we've looked at how well they work together. Can our audience agree or disagree? And last but not least, does it actually persuade us? So based on everything we've looked at, the fallacies that are there, the hidden premises that are there, is this a strong argument? What do you guys think? And I do, as you guys are typing, I know you're just going crazy typing. So I do want to remind you, when we first asked you guys, what do you think about this argument? Initial thoughts. Most of you said, yeah, it sounds pretty valid. It sounds like, she knows what she's talking about. But now, several of you are saying, nope, it's too personal. Nope, it's not a strong argument. Nope, it's not rooted in fact. So this is the conclusion that we want our students to come to. We want our students to be able to clearly say, no, this is not a strong argument, because the things do not work together the way that we need them to. And we've given them criteria in order to make that decision soundly. Okay.
Can we get Ms. Brown to explain what she means?
Oh yeah, Miss Brown says it's not setting off fireworks for me. Miss Brown,
Not setting off. Got you.
No fireworks for you, Miss Brown.
No, at first I thought maybe, but there were a lot of personal biases stated.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't think it was that strong.
And, Miss Lucas and I, as we were, going through this argument, we kind of started out with the same initial thoughts that you did. We were like, oh, this is really good. He's got all these perspectives and, this is a great, strong argument. But then when we started tearing it apart, we found the same thing that you did. This is much too personal. There's not that rooting in facts that we need. Now, this is a good point, Miss Latham. I'm glad you brought this up. It is very easy to agree, okay? And that's not what we're asking. That's not what we ask our students. What we're asking is it strong? And that's why we have to go back to our criteria. So thank you for pointing that out. That's very true.
And if I could add, that is a very good point. And I think that is kind of where we are in the world today, is everybody is driven by emotion and what they agree with, and people aligning their thoughts with them, as opposed to standing back and stepping back and evaluating the facts and the evidence within an argument. And we have to be sure that our students understand, because this is a skill set that they need. Ms. Stewart says, I didn't like it. Men have an advantage, but they shouldn't have to step down and let women take over. Absolutely, Ms. Stewart. That's one of the things that we talked about too. If you guys didn't have time, you didn't have time to get through the fallacies and the generalizations. But if you would have had time, that would have been a great part of the conversation. We talked about, well, that wouldn't be gender equity if all the men gave up their roles in order for the women to take their spot. Now the men are at the same disadvantage women were in. So very good point, guys.
And Miss Latham, I like the fact that you brought this up, that, you know, your students typically, they want to do that. You give them different point of views and they're like, oh, well, that one's right because I agree with it. And that's why it's so important to really give them those criteria and say, this is not about what you agree with or don't agree with. It's what the criteria is telling us. So thank you, Miss Latham. Those are really good points. Thank you, guys. So the last thing that we wanted to really talk to you about was just thinking about this and how you're going to do this in your PLCs and the process that your PLCs can go through when you're teaching argument. So first thing, and this is exactly what Ms. Lucas and I did when we were planning this, we took the standard, we broke it apart. We used our no do prove to see exactly what we needed to do. And then we pulled that academic vocabulary. So that's what we did yesterday. Now, these are all the steps that you and your PLCs can take. And we thought through and we talked through and reflected how we do these processes. And that's how we came up with our criteria that we would give to our students. Now, lastly is where we came in and found our text. So we created those criteria and we searched those credible databases, and we read and analyzed the text in detail. We took a lot of time tearing apart these texts to make sure they were either yes, credible and solid, or no, these arguments were not. So these are the steps that your PLC can go through in order to plan more effective argument lessons for your teachers. So lastly, before we let you go, we just wanted to review our objectives again. Yesterday, we talked about identifying claims and evaluating logic and reason. And today, we showed you some ways to assess validity and how to evaluate the slant and bias. And we gave you some tools to do that as well. So as you guys are finishing up and you're leaving us, please take time to complete the evaluation and protracts that will come out to you once this session is over. And we thank you so much for your time and attention. And if you have anything for us, any comments, please make them. We appreciate you.
And I would also like to mention, if you are planning argument and you want some help with this, reach out to the corresponding. If you are high school, it will be Lane. If you are middle school, it will be myself. Okay. And we would not mind spending some time actually going through what we didn't have time to get through today. Okay. Thank you,
Yes.
guys.
Thank you all. We appreciate you. Miss Biggs says she will need your assistance, Miss Lucas.
I see it. I got you, Miss Biggs. Got you, guys. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.